Hi, y'all. Thank you, Julie, for such a wonderful introduction. I'm very excited about the deer. That was a weird thing to say. So my name is DeMoss. I'm with Anthropology and Icon, and I am so grateful to be here with you today. I'm grateful that I arrived safely in Athens, Georgia. I'm grateful to see all of your beautiful faces, and I'm grateful for water. I woke up near a branch of the Oconee River today, and it was a really glorious sight. If you were with me at the Human Nature School, the site of my dissertation research in Traverse City, Michigan, we would all be sitting in a circle right now on the lawn of the Grand Traverse Commons, and we would all go around in a circle and share our gratitudes with one another. We don't have time for that now. But what I'd like to do is share with you an activity from Human Nature School. And Human Nature School, just to give you a very brief explanation right now, is an outdoor education, informal education program. It's one of several programs, like Julie was saying, across North America and across Western Europe, and their goal is to teach people to have emotional connections with nature. So I'm going to do a very brief demonstration of a teaching method that they would use all the time in their programs. So I'd invite anyone who'd like to come step up here with me and find a place where you can maybe have a tiny bit of room to step around. So anyone who wants to, like all of you, just come up for it. It'll just take a second. Truly it will. And the rest of you can see what this is like. So for those of you who are standing, thank you so much. I'm going to invite you to just ground yourself, take a deep breath in and out, and imagine that inside your feet there are roots. And those roots are penetrating through the floor of this building. And they're connecting with the earth below you. And it doesn't matter that you might have to go through a couple of floors of buildings and perhaps an undergraduate student to do so. But you're going to connect with the earth down below, and you're going to take another deep breath. If you're in the Human Nature School, you really want to be able to see animals in their natural habitat that aren't afraid of you. And you need to move in a way that's nature connected. So you might want to have your eyes open for this, and of you who have closed your eyes. You're going to shift your weight to one foot. You're going to step out with the other foot and just set your heel down on the ground. You're going to roll through that foot, keeping the weight in your back leg. Because you don't want to actually put the weight in your foot. What if you step on a branch and you scare a deer away? Once you're sure it's safe, you glide forward a little bit. And then you do the same thing. You step forward with your heel. Let the weight of your foot, or let your foot kind of drift down to the floor. Is it safe? If so, you can glide forward. If you guys want, just practice doing that. I know it's hard because there are people in your way probably, so you might have to adjust. And if you want, just kind of let your vision be diffuse and undefined. You're not trying to look at anything in particular. You're noticing where you're seeing motion, and you're moving slowly and meditatively. Because if you move too fast, you might miss the animals out there. So move as slowly as you want, keeping that weight on your back foot until you're sure you're not going to step on a tree branch or on something that's going to give you away. I'd love to give you as much time as possible to do this, but I just wanted to demonstrate a couple of methods. Your fox walking, which is what that's called because you're walking silently and still as a fox, and your owl eyes, looking with your diffuse vision. If we were at Human Nature School as well, after we had done that, we would have story time. All the students in kid or adult programs would have done some movement, we would have done a gratitude in a circle, and then we'd sit down and have our snacks and our stories. So I'm going to tell you a very abbreviated version of the founder story for Human Nature School. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, or early 1900s, in the Southwest US, a young Native American boy worked really hard on his skills. He worked very hard on fox walking and on owl eyes. He one day really impressed the elders of his village by sneaking up on and touching a sleeping wolf, and they gave him the name Stalking Wolf. In his old age, Stalking Wolf moved to New Jersey and mentored a man called Tom Brown Jr. Tom Brown Jr. grew up and taught everything he knew about scouting, stalking, tracking animals to a man named John Young. John Young grew up in New Jersey, and then he started an entire nature connection movement. He created an educational pedagogy based on all the things he'd been taught by Tom Brown Jr. He started a school in Duval, Washington that trains nature connection educators in all these different skills and about creating emotional connections to nature. And that is where a couple of the protagonists in our stories come in. In 2011, Matt and Kriya Miller, you can see here Kriya on the left, Matt on the right, attended this school in Duval, Washington, and they learned how to become nature connection educators, and that's how our paths crossed and how I ended up in Traverse City, Michigan, doing my dissertation research on this really interesting educational movement that tries to teach people to be connected to nature through emotional connections. And so I'm gonna put you in Traverse City with me for a second, just to show you where I was. This is Traverse City, where that green dot was, right there, right in the pinky of the Lower Peninsula. It's a town of about 15,000 people, about 93% of whom are white. The median income is about $53,000, and it's a somewhat economically depressed region. It's really difficult for people who grow in Traverse City to stay there, and there's a lot of homelessness in the area because of this. This is a tourist map of Michigan, and where those cherries are and where that green arrow is, that's where Traverse City is. About 500,000 people every summer descend upon Traverse City to go to the Cherry Festival and various other festivals. There's a lot of hiking and a lot of outdoor activities, and so it's very difficult to find a place to live. It's a very insular community. If you haven't been born there, you're a fudgy, because obviously when you go there, you eat a lot of fudge for the rest of your life. I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures. This is a picture of Traverse City facing southward. There's the bay, and this is all downtown here, and Human Nature School, where I did my work, is about a mile away from here. This is facing outwards, north towards the Grand Traverse Bay that's on Lake Michigan. And so you can see here the Leelanau Peninsula, the Old Mission Peninsula right here, downtown Traverse City here. I lived around here, and Human Nature School is around here. And it's just a really beautiful area. I think it's easy to see why a lot of people are attracted to it, because it's so gorgeous. Here's the bay, where a couple of Human Nature School kids are sailing their canoe out into the bay. They're attached by a rope, by the way. They made this canoe out of canvas. And just to let you know, too, I have a lot of pictures of kids in these slides, and I have IRB permission to do so. I couldn't guarantee anonymity because I used video methods, and so you're going to hear real names and see pictures of a lot of kids that I have permission to do so. This is a picture of the Grand Traverse Commons. So this is about a mile from downtown Traverse City. This is the old Michigan Asylum, the old Northern Michigan Asylum. It used to house people who were diagnosed with mental illnesses. It fell into disrepair in about the 1980s. It was renovated and turned into luxury condos, stores. And if you look right here in this little cinder block building, this is where Human Nature School has their office. They do a lot of work outdoors, but they have to have somewhere to meet. And if you had been at Human Nature School with me, you would have circled up right around here to do gratitudes with me and to listen to these stories that I have to tell you. After those stories, you would separate off into a group with your instructor, and you'd take one of many paths into the Grand Traverse Commons, about 500 acres of wooded area behind this. So that's kind of the site of where I did all this. So what's interesting about the Human Nature School? And what attracted me to it in the first place? The first premise, again, is that students in nature connection programs should be learning to make caring, emotional connections with non-humans who can reciprocate those relationships as people. And this caring for non-humans as companions in life is supposed to promote what John Young, again, the originator of the educational method that Human Nature School uses, it's supposed to promote what John Young and Human Nature School calls caretaking, which I'll get into in a bit. And another thing is that nature connection education is at its heart about societal change. So John Young wants to have, in his words, a naturalist on every corner, like Jack Hannert here, an instructor at Human Nature School. So one of the foundational narratives here is that North American culture is maladaptive, and nature connection education is a key for transforming culture so that abusive extraction of resources can stop. So looking at this educational method, I formed this overarching question. How does non-human social interaction within wilderness education affect pedagogical opportunities for teaching about conservation? Or in other words, how does regarding non-humans as knowledgeable participants in human society, as some members of Human Nature School do, shape environmental education? And I broke this down into a few components. First of all, I think of this as a what question about caretaking. What are their motivations in the first place? So these social relationships with non-humans are supposed to promote caretaking, which is kind of their version of conservation. But it also is contrasted with conservation. And so it was a very slippery concept that I felt like I really needed to get a handle on. So my first question, what is caretaking? And how do relationships of care and a desire for cultural transformation affect caretaking activity? The next question I think of as a how question. How do they propose to teach their students to have these social relationships with non-humans? So what are the concepts and methods that surround the practices of including non-humans as these active partners in education? And the last I think of as a who question. Who are the nature connected? Who are their role models, their heroes that they look up to? So I turned to their stories, primarily because stories are a part of almost every single aspect of human nature school programming. They're going to happen almost every single time you go to a program, which I'll tell you about what those programs are in a minute. So my story is, what are the characteristics of the nature connected? And again, like noticing, if you notice that lineage of an indigenous person teaching white people how to be nature connected, there's a lot of indigenous characters in their stories. So I also wanted to know what kind of world do they want to see and how their stories articulate with scholars calling to decolonize environmental education. There's also a body of literature that I turned to, several bodies of literature I turned to for this, that shape this inquiry. And one of the first things that really struck me in doing preliminary research with nature connection programs is that the body is the site of nature connection education. You kind of want to cut this part off right here and just use your intuition. Try to feel what animals are feeling and use your gut a lot and actually create a connection between your gut and the world. So I turn to embodiment literature, which conceives of human bodies as the seat of culture. So this is theory suggesting that cultural learning to be a part of a community is about the body, of observing and actually moving in ways that are culturally acceptable, and not necessarily just transmission of different concepts, but actually your body within an environment or inseparable from the environment that you're in, learning to be a cultured person. So I wanted to understand as well how community membership is extended to non-humans like foxes or streams or mullein plants. So I turned to what some people call multi-species ethnography or post-humanism, and this is a body of a lot of ideas, but what I focused on most is what several scholars like Donna Haraway or Anna Singh or Vakile Zumalo or Africa Taylor think of as non-humans already being involved in the social life of human beings. So whether you talk about a horseshoe training, the forest in Michigan that were cut down to build Chicago, uranium, carbon dioxide, non-humans shape us, not through environmental determinism, but a lot of what some of these authors are saying is that there is agency and liveliness and personhood to non-humans. And I also want to acknowledge too some criticism of this scholarship that talks about the fact that there's been a lot of research into societies that believe in the personhood and liveliness of spirits, of animals, of different non-humans, that's been pulled from indigenous communities. So I ran across this really great article by Métis scholar Zoe Todd, who said that this type of scholarship is just another word for colonialism, taking these ideas and then turning them into theory, presenting them as if they're new. So I want to acknowledge that before I move on. Again, Human Nature School and the Deep Nature Connection Movement desire to use educational tools to transform society, so I turned to what's called transformative learning theory, which was developed by educational researcher Jack Mesereau, which is a theory about adult learning and transforming the lenses through which we filter our experiences. And so again, this applies to adults. This isn't about the kids' education. So Mesereau posited that within people's lives there are times when our worldviews are challenged and our internalized assumptions can be brought to light for critical assessments. And so through his research, he came up with a series of stages, which I don't mean to present as something that's linear, like you go through this and you go through this and you go through this and then you're transformed. But this is just suggesting that you may encounter a disorienting dilemma in your life, something that's kind of distressing in some way. And then you're able to kind of assess the assumptions critically that you have. And then you can think about planning a new course of action, trying on new roles. And this is about how in adult learning and adult education, people have their perspectives transformed. I'm betting that a lot of you have experienced that yourself. So how does that happen? I'm so sorry. There is an emancipatory side to transformative education as well. As scholar Edward Taylor put it, the change in these lenses through which we view the world, what are called meaning perspectives, with transformative education is hopefully towards a more inclusive, critically reflective, just society. And then considering education, I took a finer grade approach to storytelling practices. This is Chelsea Nestor, an educator with Human Nature School, telling a story about being a frog. I was struck by what I was reading about the power of stories, as Heather Swanson and Al write in their chapter of Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet. Material worlds and the stories we tell about them are bound up with each other. So I'm using the lens of speculative fiction, what Donna Haraway calls speculative fabulation, what some people call science fiction. There are nuances there that I'm not going to get into with those different terms. But I'm using that lens to analyze the possible desired futures suggested within H&S's storytelling practices, asking, who are their story heroes, and what kind of world are they willing into being with these stories. And a lot of their stories are about ideas of what Indigenous people are like, or interpretations of Indigenous people's stories. So this inquiry required a look into literature on decolonization, such as Indigenous people's desires to represent themselves in the world as contemporary people, or stereotypes that have been repeated throughout environmental education of the ecological native who is perfect, is in harmony with nature, and if someone doesn't fit that stereotype, they may be erased from discourse around how do you interact with the world. So this is just a recap. These are the literatures I'm using, and I'm going to take a drink of water. So let's look at some methods of inquiry that I used. To answer these questions, the first being participant observation. So they very much needed an instructor for their courses, and they were very eager to incorporate me into their school. So I went along to all the adult and kids courses, any sort of lecture they had, any just one-off classes that they had, fundraisers, ceremonies, any sort of extracurricular activity they had. And this is actually instructor Chelsea Nestor's foot, and we are out looking for wild rice. So basically, me following people around for 2 years and taking notes about everything they do, it was very intrusive, and I love these people so much. These are the actual programs that I did participant observation is, and a lot of what you're going to hear about today is with those homeschooled children ages 7 to 12 because they met twice a week, almost every single week. Preschool kids, hard time getting permission to do work with them. Just went and hung out with them because they were cool. Summer camp kids, I very often had to work as an instructor in these camps because they were super understaffed. After school kids I worked with, and then teen programs, I was there one Saturday per month. And then for the adult programs, you're going to see that there are fewer interactions. These are things that are taking place once a month. So apprenticeship, where people go for about 9 months, 1 week in a month, learning how to do nature connection teaching. You're learning how to be a mentor and learning how to be nature connected. These are one-off classes, like learning how to make candles or make soaps. Extended family, this indicates anyone who is an adult who isn't necessarily involved in a class, like being an instructor, who's involved in some way. And that includes elders, who are older people who are supposed to have this overarching view about the organization and give advice on things. Committee meetings and the board of director, I also attended all of those as a participant observer. I did semi-structured interviews. I formally interviewed all the staff and volunteers, all of those apprentices, the adult class participants, all the extended family, all of the elders, everyone who was on the board and committee. So that's 34 adults, some of whom were interviewed multiple times. And I also did landscape walking interviews inspired by ethnobotany walking interviews. So I had instructors who were there within the semester that I was doing this. They would take me out. Jake Moran, this instructor from Human Nature School, set the first route. I said, take me out somewhere where you would take the kids, show me what you would show the kids, talk to me about the landscape, what are the memories of this area, what are these places called to you? And then I had all the other instructors take the same route. So he's holding the GoPro camera because it wasn't functioning right, and he has a recorder. And because I don't have a lot of pictures of myself, I had to include this. This is probably what a lot of my GoPro footage looks like at the very beginning, honestly. So I'm giving you a chance to take a picture. And this is how paranoid I was about losing data. He had a recorder, he had a video camera, I had a notebook, I had a video camera with audio capabilities, and I wrote in that notebook while I video recorded him, because I am crazy. I also performed video elicitation interviews, and both of these, the landscape walks and this, they're such great methods. So I was inspired by Joe Tobin's work with preschool and three cultures, and I did video elicitation. Basically, every semester I would go out with Human Nature School programs. I would video the entire day of programs. This is in the winter time, so this is a group that's going to have a lot fewer kids than regular programs do. And I know it's on a tripod because that is me bending over right there. But I did video with all their programs. I would take those semester-long programs and turn them into 30-minute chunks. And I would have instructors from each of those semesters view those 30-minute chunks and ask them questions. I would use it to elicit information as an interview tool. Then, I would, while I was doing that, video record them, watching video recordings of themselves, and record everything that they were doing. So this is Matt Miller and Korea Miller watching video of themselves. This is Lena Wilson laughing at some video of herself. She's also an instructor at Human Nature School. So let's look at what I did with all that stuff in terms of all those field notes, all that interview data, which I put into a qualitative data analysis software named Max QDA, and I love this book so much, Miles Huberman and Saldani's advice for analyzing qualitative data. So let's look at this first question about caretaking relationships of care. So what I did was I followed their advice for first cycle coding. So basically what you're seeing is all that interview data. I had to transcribe it, all the field notes and everything transcribed, put into MaxQDA, and then I went through every single bit of it and coded it for different themes that were coming up. If it's in quotation marks, like nature's experience of you, self-agency of the non-human world, give the land back to herself, those are direct quotes. There's also things like processes, or descriptors, like picking up trash is caretaking, environmental activities at HNS, caretaking the commons, caretaking is taking down forts and planting trees. So this was the first step that I did to go through it. And so what I did after that was I used a whiteboard feature of MaxQDA, put all 188 codes that came out of this data on there, and then clumped them into categories. So looking at what was actually in those coded pieces of text, how do these things go together? And then once they're clumped together, creating larger themes around that to show kind of what these data is about. So self-agency of the non-human world is that larger theme under which all of this text is lumped. And these are the numbers of times that those things were coded. Caretaking is about respect or reverence for non-humans. All of this goes into that particular category. I also performed another analysis that I have more about if you'd like to hear more about it. Oh, and I wanted to point out up here too, transformation is going to be a really big part of what they're talking about. What I also did was basically extract from MaxQDA every mention of non-humans within those field notes and interviews, except for where I was writing it down for reference for myself. This isn't about me. And then I did an analysis coding all of those mentions of non-humans and putting those into categories, which again I can show you more data of that if you would like to see it. Trying to see how do they categorize non-humans, what do they think they're for? So, looking, are they for friendship? Should you conserve them and never ever touch them? Or should you be using them? So that's what this analysis is about. So looking at the results of this, what is caretaking and what are these relationships of care like? Caretaking is defined a lot in opposition to stewardship or conservation. That's a form of protection from public intervention. So Creed and Miller says, I don't think conservation is the right term for what human nature still does. My understanding of it is it's a lot more hands-off. Generally speaking, conservation is really close to preservation, and a lot of people are limited in how they can interact with the land. They're working to create their own agreements that involve humans as part of the landscape, which means a lot of interaction, the ability to harvest things. So caretaking is not conservation. So what is it? For one, it's active intervention in landscapes by knowledgeable people, but I'm not talking about people with degrees in ecology. Knowledgeable people are people who have done their fox walking and their owl eyes. They've gone outside and done outdoor meditations. They're the people who are able to do caretaking on landscapes. I wanted to show you here too, using non-humans is a really big part of nature connections. So you might see here caretaking is extractive and about use value. There's not a lot of values here. But that's because they're all over here and they probably should have been lumped together. Humans, non-humans are useful. Actively interacting with the landscape. Beings can suffer for nature connection. They might die because you need to have that interaction with a non-human in order for you to become a better caretaker and understand what non-human lives are like. So examples from caretaking from this are hunting, doing things like creating animal habitats by putting out brush piles, not harvesting too many plants whenever you are looking to wildcraft, so to forage and eat them and make medicines out of them. For adults, picking up trash, permaculture garden, putting goats out to eat spotted knapweed. So these are all things that require active intervention. And when you look here too, there aren't a lot of instances, or only 7% of instances from that analysis show that non-humans are just for conserving, for not touching. Like this is hands off, you don't touch it. 25% of those mentions are from using them. So from harvesting medicine, hunting, landscaping, even just swimming, that came up a couple times. And then 20% of the time, non-humans are for making friends with. And this came up a lot with trees, I think, because they sit there and let you touch them. It's true. Another piece of this is the emotional piece, and having emotional connections and spiritual and relational connections is part of caretaking. So as Stephanie Mills, one of the extended family members, said about nature school and structures, I think they're fostering a sort of mature and reciprocal relationship with the natural world. So you can see here examples like some of the codes are respect for the land, reverence for all life, Emotional connections, having your own relationship with things, reciprocal relationships with the natural world. So that's coming up a number of times in the things that they're saying. But what I'd like to argue here is that care for nature isn't just something that Human Nature School owns, right? So a lot of people from Edward Abbey to Louise Chawla, they love nature. I'm sure a lot of people in here do. So what I'm not arguing that caring for nature is the only thing that's going on here. But I argue that what HNS is trying to accomplish is a shift in the ontological statuses of non-humans, from resources to persons that you can have relationships with. So to some HNS adult participants, and I'll talk about why that's adults here in a second, particularly instructors, extended family members, and elders, non-humans are agential beings who are capable of entering into reciprocal relationships of care across these species and material differences. So when instructor Jake Moran says, teaches the self-agency of the non-human world, he says that it's based around the idea that man is not the measure of all things, that the world doesn't sort of exist on our agenda or for our purposes. The animals have their own needs. To live, you need to, to some extent, you're going to destroy something, but it's almost like you need permission to do that. And permission is something that instructor would ask of beings, particularly plants. So if an instructor is out with a group of kids, or especially a group of adults, they're going to ask a plant, can I harvest this plant? And if they get either a literal psychic transmission from the plant, or they have a feeling inside their bodies that this is something they shouldn't do, they won't do it. And I've watched this happen. They're asking permission from the world to be able to take from it. Instructor Scott Mills said that something he wanted to teach was the spirit in each place, each ecosystem, each tree, each bird, each insect, to be receptive to and acknowledge the spirit in each of those things. So the difference here with deep nature connection practices is that caretaking the landscape is literally the landscape being able to talk to you and tell you what it wants. Whether through how it responds materially or through how you literally receive psychic transmissions from non-humans. So you don't need a degree in ecology. You need to go out and do your nature connection practices so that you can develop that kind of connection. So when I'm saying nature connection, that's exactly what I'm talking about. This is not spoken about out loud to kids, very often overtly, as I've just stated it. They don't want to scare the parents. There are a lot of issues with, for instance, what if you're working with a homeschool family who is avoiding public school because they're very religious? There was actually an instance in which something came up where a kid was very frightened of the idea of witches. Told his parents who were, it was, I don't need to go into the full explanation, but it was a funny song for Halloween, and they were very, very upset that that was mentioned. So that's the reason why you're seeing this with adults and not with kids. It's kind of an underlying mission that they hope is just going to come along for the ride. Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm so sorry. I made you miss this slide with a hognose steak. This is about what I just talked about. Let's talk about transforming relations. So what about seeing transformation in the ways that humans view non-humans as agents because of this pedagogy, which is what I was trying to figure out here. What are the transformations that they have? Transformations were often about small personal changes in perspective as a result of being involved in Human Nature School, which is honestly what they expect too. They think that each individual is going to have their own kind of transformation as a result of this, that not everybody's going to think the same thing. So here are a few examples of transformations that people said occurred because they were involved with Human Nature School. So Chelsea called her transformation, Chelsea Nestor, instructor, as a result of being involved, shifting language so that I'm giving life to things that have life in my words. Like those pine trees, like that juniper bush over there, like the chickadee welcoming us into the forest. So like this shift in my attitude to wanting to be inclusive in my language to the maple tree community. You know, this community that's part of my community, but they're not Homo sapiens. A couple of people said that they did have transformations in terms of seeing non-humans as persons as a result. But there were other kinds of transformations. So a few members of the elders community said, what they loved about Human Nature School was that the kind of pressure for engagement that they received from the directors, Matt and Kriya, particularly Matt, who was modeling this all of this off of what John Young does and wanted to have an elders community. That kind of pressure for engagement gave them the sense that they weren't just olders, but that they were elders. And they actually had something to offer their community instead of just getting old and dying. One woman said that she had noticed the change in her mom through her participation with the extended family and the board of directors, that she had started out of the blue buying organic food, and she started doing the bookkeeping for the organization, and she was volunteering all this time that she normally wouldn't do. So these aren't necessarily quite transformations into relationship of care. Oh, I'm so sorry. Relationships of care with non-humans, but they are people who have experienced a disorienting dilemma. So for instance, Jack Hannert, one of the instructors, said, I I was thrown into this position. I didn't have any training in this. This has been the most stressful time of learning how to do a job, and it's really transformed my perspective of myself in relation to these kids. Or in the case of the elders, an entire year of them trying to figure out what does it mean to be an elder. That was the conversation for every single meeting that we went to, every time I went to visit one of the elders in their houses. I don't know what being an elder is. I'm so upset. I'm supposed to be doing something and I don't know what this means. So you're seeing some of these disorienting dilemmas that people are going through, and then how they're trying out these different roles and figuring out, well, I don't actually know what it even means to be nature connected. So I'm just going to try these things and see if they work. Similarly, I'm arguing that there are emancipatory stances for humans and non-humans within this deep nature connection education. So Human Nature School places non-humans as active partners whose needs and desires should be met and sees them as existing for themselves, which is what Freire says in Pedagogy for the Oppressed, is that people who are learners should be learning for themselves. They should exist for themselves. They're not tools for someone else to use. And that's also how they include both humans and non-humans into this kind of emancipatory education. And when Matt Miller said you don't need a degree in botany to become a caretaker or ecology, this is a challenge to educational practices that rely upon people in authority to mandate the conditions for naturalist knowledge and conservation practices that have to unfold. Their idea is basically, we can do whatever we want. Like, that tree told me what it wanted right now. I had a transmission from that tree. I know what it wants. I don't need to have a degree, although it might be helpful to know what that tree is. So they're not against naturalist knowledge. We have to shift gears. Let's look now at the how. How do they go about doing this? How are they trying to educate people's bodies to be nature connected? I have a lot of video data, as you may have surmised, a lot of video data. And Joe Tobin suggested what I should do is find instances of instructors directly teaching people to be nature-connected people. So I selected 4 scenes to do a microanalysis. This is Matt Miller, the large person in brown, who is showing kids how to track animals using a track that the kids actually found in cement on a sidewalk next to the commons. This is a blindfolded sensory game. So this is Kriya there in the blue jacket in the middle, and she has instructed all the kids to put blindfolds on, and she has taken things that she's found in nature, like a wild leek and a couple other pieces of nature, and she's passing them around and telling them, I don't want you to guess what it is. I want you to feel it, I want you to smell it, I want you to use your senses to experience whatever it is. And then just tell me what that's like. Don't tell me what it is. That's not even important or useful information. There's a bird language skit. So this is, what you can't see on the other side is a group of summer camp kids who are watching this, but this is basically some instructors, volunteers, and kids acting out the language of the birds. So trying to tell these kids, oh, if there's a predator coming for you, like Remy is coming for Emily down there, who's so unsuspecting, if there's a predator coming, what are the birds going to sound like? How does that feel inside your body whenever you hear that? Are you going to recognize bird language whenever you hear it? So that's what that is. And this is animal forms. So this is an exercise, again, if you were at the Commons at Human Nature School, you'd be in a circle, and somebody like Kriya Miller, who's leading them right now, might say you need to roll your shoulders like a red-tailed hawk getting ready to take off for flight, or you need to roll your shoulders like a barred owl puking up an owl pellet full of fur and bones, or you might need to mark your territory like a coyote does. It's great. It's so much fun to see what they're doing. And so what a microanalysis looks like for me is taking these small bits of video that are only a couple minutes in length and watching them over and over and over and over and over and over again. Taking them frame by frame and looking at how was attention directed towards different things? How are people moving their bodies? Who was participating? Who wasn't? How people mimicked or ignored each other in the case of imitating animals, which is what a lot of this pedagogy is about, how accurate they were in their imitations of birds. And then combining that with those attentions gleaned from what they're saying in the moment in these actual videos, so transcribing that, which was already in the Max QDA. And looking back on this textual analysis at the prevalence of certain themes, such as this piece here, people with the attributes of animals, or what you can't see there is people turning into animals. So these videos do show key aspects of nature. I'm so sorry, I keep skipping this. So again, looking at these other themes, this is what it looks like when you put Max QDA data into a whiteboard to lump it together. So self-agency of the non-human world popping up again, talking to non-humans and getting a response, looking to non-humans as people, and this, which you're going to see how important it is, paying attention to non-humans, certain directed attention. So these videos do show key aspects of nature connection practice. So people acting out motions as animals unless they are grumpy and don't want to, like Seamus there with his folded arms. Or bird language to kids acting as birds being stalked like a predator species. This is a moment before Emily dies. It was really sad. They cut off their senses of sight to increase their sensory skills and use them as animals, for instance, whose dominant feature, according to nature connection instructors, is smell, for instance. So you're trying to smell things and get a sense of like, what does an animal who doesn't have very good vision see the world like, or feel the world like, right? And then attending to the movements of non-humans in the most prevalent shapes one can make in human nature school, standing around or kneeling around in a circle somewhere and staring at something that's on the ground, whether that's a track or animal scat, bones, and lots of movement, not lots of attention to movement as Matt is shaping the direction of their attention, as he's touching different areas of that track. And the kids around him are in their own turn reaching out to touch the pieces of that track to feel, what is it that Matt feels? So let's talk about nature connection practice that includes non-humans as active partners. When I asked Kriya Miller about what are animal forms for, like is this just a warm-up or something? She said it's stirring the imagination, and for some people that can be a powerful tool. I'm abridging what this says, obviously. Some people actually feel like they can understand what it's like to be an animal, so bridging that vast, giant gap. It's like if you can imagine it and you can be it, for a lot of kids that comes naturally. It's like you're that much more connected, you're that much more there. So let's look at some of the ways that they try to get people to have these attributes of animals. Again, people with attributes of animals are turning into them. Playing games where kids mimic blue jays trying to eat food outside an animal's den. Games mimicking animals that they're tracking. Games where kids are Cooper's hawks and chickadees, or sleeping fawns, or bats and moths, or bees trying to lead others to their source of pollen. And then there are stories, which we're going to get to more later, so I'm just going to tell you a little piece of one. Instructor Chelsea Nestor told a story during a weekday homeschool program about a girl who had psychic dreams about what it would be like to be a beaver with webbed feet and this beautiful fat tail. When it was over, she asked the kids, have you ever gotten a psychic vision from an animal about what it's like to be that animal? And two of the kids raised their hands and said they did. Elder Carol Laughing Waters was there in the circle listening to the story, and she said, that actually happened to me. Thanks for sharing my story. And Chelsea said, thanks for psychically sending me that story. So what I'm arguing here is that instructors are encouraging participants to literally experience the life of other beings through nature connection practices and forging those connections that escape these discrete boundaries of individual bodies as suggested by people like David Abram and Donna Haraway. Another method for including non-humans in pedagogy is attention. So again, looking at this larger theme, process of becoming nature connected, paying attention to non-humans. I coded that 159 times in the text data that I had. One of the ways to do so is through things like fox walking and owl eyes. Those are called core routines of nature connection for a reason. They're literally how you're supposed to pay attention to non-humans. There are other methods like asking constant questions as an instructor, showing the kids where and how to look, like Matt did with the tracking. And some of that is sensory, such as the game that Kriya was playing from the video analysis, where she had the kids sink into their senses and trying to feel what that's like to be a non-human. Or one that's shown here, which is a game called Firekeeper, where the person blindfolded in the middle is supposed to be able to listen to what these other kids are doing as they try to walk towards her and steal probably little sticks that are food that are in front of her. So she has to point them out before they get to her. Nature connection practice, I'm arguing here, is about locating humans within a multi-species cohort. So for instance, deer have acute hearing. Getting near one means being a deer. Thinking innocuous, gentle deer thoughts. Moving slowly, being mindful of the wind like they have to. And there's so much more here, but my basic argument is that nature connection pedagogy is designed to help humans feel within their bodies what non-humans are like, turn their attention towards them, and have embodied experiences that connect them with non-humans as other kinds of people who have agency in the world. We have to move on. So looking at my last bit of analysis here, the stories that they tell, these characteristics of the nature connected. For this, I analyzed 73 stories. I actually collected a lot more stories than that, but since I had to work as an instructor a lot of the times, sometimes I was too busy wiping a kid's nose or taking them to the bathroom to actually write something down. So I chose 73 that actually had enough text about the plots and themes to analyze. I extracted those from my main body of textual data and did a separate analysis on them, using again that first the coding cycle through Miles et al. That I was talking to you about. So coding for what they were doing. So in the stories, people talking to animals, offering gratitude to plants through stories. If it's a quote, again, it's something they actually said, the stories are the mark of what we want to convey. Animals getting used to people, being still to see animals. So each of these are different ways that I coded the stories for different themes that were popping up. And again, put them on the whiteboard, clustered them together by looking at what is inside those codes, the text inside the codes, not just what the name of the code is. And putting them into these larger thematic categories like growing as a person as a result of nature exposure, communication with animals as peers as possible, indigenous peoples are valuable role models. I also did, so you can see here again, this is what it looks like on the whiteboard. I also did kind of just, this is just descriptive statistics. 70% of these stories were true, 30% were invented. It's easy to tell which is which because in the morning meetings before anyone shows up, adult or kid, we talk about the themes of the stories. Is this going to go with the day's practice that we have? Why are you telling this particular story? I also coded stories from indigenous communities as true, not ones that were kind of made up, like vague stories about, this person's from a tribe and they live in a teepee, but like literal stories like the Haudenosaunee peacemaker story, which is an incredible story, or stories about Nanabojo, an Anishinaabe trickster. 27% of the stories had indigenous as main characters. Characters of European origin were stories about, for instance, the origin of particular holidays, or goddess stories, particularly by one volunteer who came a lot. Non-humans were main characters 36% of the time. We're going to talk about survivalism here. It was a topic of stories 29% of the time. We're not going to get to death, but we are going to talk about characters with supernatural powers from nature connection. So, looking here at indigenous people as valuable role models, just to give you some examples of some of the stories that were told. Like I said, there are stories about Anishinaabe trickster Nanabojo, a story about indigenous Australian dreaming, actually 2 of those. Multiple stories about stalking wolf, because Tom Brown pops up a lot in his pedagogy because he's part of this lineage. A story about Ingwe, actually probably about 4 stories about Ingwe, who's an interesting character, connected with John Young, who was actually a white person in South Africa who was spent a lot of time with an Akamba village and learned a lot from them, and so he's considered to be an indigenous person within this particular lineage. Again, the Haudenosaunee peacemaker story, which I heard 4 times when I was there. It's actually a really wonderful story. And then in terms of stories from European context, 2 people in particular, one of whom is really interested in Norse mythology in a very non-neo-Nazi way, just to let you know. He'd be very upset if anyone thought that of him. But he told a lot of stories about Balder and Odin and about Norse mythology because he very, very, what's that word? Intentionally bucked the trend of, bucked the trend of telling stories about indigenous Native American people. The other thing about survivalism, some examples are Tom Brown's stories. He's the ultimate survivor, whether people attended his wilderness survival classes or told stories about him from his numerous books. Matt Miller, the executive director of Human Nature School Survival Trips, he has 2 stories. He told them 4 times while I was there. He made up a story about the North Pole and the beings and the spirits in the North Pole that was really about avoiding hypothermia. And there are also stories of bad survivalists. So for instance, volunteer Riley Dickey, actually 3 of his stories were about being real bad at it. So there's this book circulating called Deep Survival, which is actually a really cool book. And so he took some examples out of that and told stories about, actually making good decisions and having a good attitude, but also just I woke up and I started running and I sweat through all my clothes and I stopped to get a drink out of a creek, but then I didn't do anything to sterilize the water and I got real sick, but I just kept running. I mean, just really crazy stuff to tell people, hey, don't do this. It's a really bad idea if you're out in the woods. Again, non-humans can be main characters like Terrence the Tree, elephants, a wolf who helped a little lost boy interpret his dreams, otters who were invited to brunch and came. 3 stories about animals decomposing and being eaten by each other and hit by cars, which were told to really young kids, which I find really interesting. Or animals offering their powers to people, such as a leopard giving its power to Ingwe in South Africa, or a little girl named Jillian getting powers from the little pieces of animals that she collected and kept in a necklace around her neck, like squirrel toenails and deer fur. And then something that I'd like to note is that these stories should be acted out by the people hearing them. These stories are intentional, they're discussed before every meeting, they are meant to be heroes so that adults and kids can mimic them. So that's something that is overtly stated in morning meetings before these. And again, that kind of goes back to something that Cree and Miller said, which is the stories are a mark of what we want to convey. So let's look at this through the lens of speculative fiction. So survivalism might make it sound as though speculations about the future are grim. They're trying to figure out how to survive without technology. And this is what Tom Brown's school, remember, one of these kind of founding people within the movement, is all about. He trained John Young, and his school is based on apocalypse. Basically, he said that Stalking Wolf gave him 4 prophecies of the apocalypse, and the children of the earth that he is training are going to have to follow his survival guidelines in order to make it through the apocalypse. It's a very grim scene. But the survival stories for Human Nature School, even though that's a direct lineage, are very different. So I'm arguing that their stories of survival are about people coming together in groups and using survival skills to aid one another. So for instance, in one story, a little girl is led by a boy in her dreams, a squirrel, and a tree to rediscover how to make fire, which saves her village, who's been without fire for years, for decades. Matt Miller told the story of his bike trip to Wilderness Awareness School across the country as a survival story. And when I asked him about it later, he said, I guess the big thing about how good Wilderness Awareness School was for people as far as their well-being is just to see what it did for our group of strangers, how we came together and how it was that narrative of people being in right relationship with the natural world, that big ecological picture. So it seemed like there was hope. It's a total contrast to Tom Brown Jr.'s kind of thing. His school is like, you survive in the natural world, but you're an individual, you're living in a bark hut by yourself. So he came away from John Young's training with the idea of a more hopeful narrative and a better story. So these are stories about people who have agency in the face of environmental issues. They're not just out there by themselves trying to survive by the skin of their teeth. And so, like I was saying, while the Deep Nature Connection movement was founded on this apocalyptic prophecy, John Young has intentionally deviated from that. He talks about that in some of his teachings. So Human Nature School is not motivated. I don't know if you have seen the enormous wealth of dystopian futures that are available for us in science fiction and speculative fiction out there. I love reading them myself. But they're not motivated by desolate, burnt Cormac McCarthy, the road stories about cannibalistic killers hunting you down on a burnt landscape. They're not about Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam series with this technological apocalypse, which is such a good series. And they're not about John Vandermeer's tribute to the destructive and redemptive powers of human technology, where basically robots are taking over the world. You can't tell what a human being is anymore. So I argue that these stories are about knowledgeable survival heroes. They escape apocalyptic and they don't escape They don't escape the apocalypse. They avert the tragedy of it entirely. So rather than using the fear of ecological degradation to spark environmental awareness in participants, they are projecting very intentionally the kinds of heroes who will prevent catastrophe altogether. Humans centered in multi-species community who don't seek to write out the future alone, but who have the kind of curiosity and skills that will aid them with even more times in the outdoor to be enchanted by nature. And this is, we have to talk about this too, because Human Nature School's tales are about admiration of indigenous people's lifestyles. For example, those indigenous characters I told you about are like Stalking Wolf and Ingwe, the Peacemaker, are depicted as having magical powers of nature connection. Almost, I would say, supernatural powers. And this is taken very literally and very seriously. So these aren't powers that they're thinking, you can't have this, these indigenous people have them. It's more like, you can be like that if you practice your stalking, or your fox walking, young Nathan. And that being said, there are ways that these stories reify what it means to be indigenous. So their stories hearken to this trope of the ecological native, which originated in the ideology that people indigenous to the Americas were part of savage or unspoiled nature, and they were incapable of properly managing lands that were colonized by invaders. So the irony of environmentalists inventing and then co-opting romantic visions of ecological natives is not lost on indigenous people, as scholars like Fine Deloria have pointed out, being rejected, stereotyped, and ignored completely. This goes along with what Philip Deloria noted as playing Indian, in which various outdoor educations like the Boy Scouts have been accused of making up indigenous legacies to legitimize these organizations. And indeed, Tom Brown, one of the originators of the Nature Connection movement, is accused of making up Stalking Wolf completely, that he doesn't even exist. This is, if you look on online forums, that's a huge to-do. Another issue is land. So Human Nature School is connecting to nature on lands that Anishinaabe people who live in the area thought through the Washington Treaty of 1836 they would have the use of in perpetuity, but they were in fact confined to reservations and are still harassed on a regular basis. So there's this inequity in the ability of people with these allotted nature connection skills to actually be able to connect to the landscapes that they supposedly have these supernatural connections with. And the stories themselves can be sovereignty issues. So for instance, if a story has a particular storyteller or has a particular season in which it's supposed to be told, sometimes that context is not actually valued or noticed. However, it's something that a few people in the Nature Connection movement are aware of, and indeed this was on the website of the second Nature Connection school John Young started in Santa Cruz, California, decolonizing environmental education. And this is something that a few people in Human Nature School were willing to talk about. So I'm not trying to talk negatively about them. It's just a part of their pedagogy. So I've noted, Julie told me I have no time left. These are the conclusions that I have. Caretaking is active management with non-humans who can reciprocate relationships. These transformations in perspective occur. They're not necessarily directed towards non-humans, though. They're emancipatory qualities. Their education methods are about feeling and being non-humans, to break it out separations, and they're alighting environmental apocalypse and redefining Indigenous people with their pedagogy. And with that, I have so much gratitude for all these people. Human Nature School let me follow them around for 2 years and video record them. It was very intrusive. My lovely parents gave me their tax returns so that I could stay alive. My committee supported me and told me different ways to help make this project better, and I'm so happy you are all here. I just did this presentation, you guys. Thank you. So, any questions?
Yeah. A very good job, first of all.
Oh, thanks.
And so the children, the students of this school, were they, you think, from families that were already very interested in teaching their children about the environment, or were there any students that came from a different background? And how do you think your findings maybe would have been different if that's the case?
Right. So that's a really good question. And I actually, what's not included in this is interviews that I did with their parents. I focus mostly on the intentions of this. So there's a whole other body of data that I have on that. And that was one of the questions that I had as well. What I found from those interviews, without having done a real formal analysis of them, is that a lot of people did come from environmentally conscious parents. They have to consider, too, that these are homeschoolers, for the most part, who are attending the year-round programs. So with the kids, that was something that popped up definitely in interviews with their parents, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination. For the adults, it can be really different. So they may just be looking for something different in their lives. They've never sat on the ground outside before. They're terrified of everything, and that definitely is something that shows up too with adult participants. Summer school kids are very different too. Their parents are trying to figure out a way to go on vacation in northern Michigan and stick their kids somewhere. Their grandparents have these kids. They need a camp to put them. That sounds really fun. So they're a whole different ballgame in and of itself. I was very lucky, I felt like, because one of my original questions was, well, does this work? Like, does this stuff work? And so I think that would have been a really difficult question to answer, considering that some people are very steeped in environmental concerns already. Yeah, Walker.
I guess a related question. I'm curious about the instructors, and if there's particular demographic groups that they fall into, or other spectrums, and are there requirements that they do particular trainings, or who are they, and how do they kind of come into these roles?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I wish I had more comparative data, because this is such a small school. As far as training, no. No training. Requirements are that you're a happy person who can tolerate being outside and tolerate being around a lot of kids who, and I say tolerate, not meaning, I mean, these kids are wonderful. Like, I love spending time around them. But you are expected to go out there and without any training at all suddenly do nature connection. So, and they're very opportunistic because they have very few employees available. So they pulled 2 people who are directly, so Cree and Matt don't have any sort of college education, a background degree in environmental education. They just went to the school, they were transformed by it, they came back and they're like, okay, it's you and me, we're gonna start a school. When they started hiring people, one of their first employees was Chelsea, who has undergrad in environmental education. And then she pulled her friends into it. So this is a very small, insular community of people who are just like, I need a job, and what you do sounds amazing, and I want to be a part of it. But in terms of training, it's a sink or swim. And usually, I mean, it's not horrible by any stretch of the imagination, but does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
Good stories.
Thanks.
It seemed like the instructors were kind of presenting this dichotomy with caretaking and conservation.
Mm-hmm.
Like they seemed pretty adamant that what they were doing was not conservation.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to know if you could just talk a little more about that and maybe question if it's really that black and white or if there's some overlap there based on some other definitions of conservation from what the natural resources or the ecology side of things.
Yeah, so looking into this, I had that question too, like how is this any different from conservation or stewardship? And in looking up, definitions of conservation or stewardship, they're all over the place too. So what I presented was mostly what they actually think about it. What I actually think about it is that there are not so many differences. I mean, they're recycling stuff. It's just that when you ask them what caretaking is, it's not doing things like recycling things or buying organic produce. It's like, I need to get out there with a bunch of sticks and put them out there so that mice will have a habitat to live in. So it's making sure that non-humans have what they need to survive. Not very different from what other conservationists do in a lot of different contexts. So I definitely didn't mean to make the case that they weren't doing conservation, but that they were very adamant that it wasn't that. And again, I think that what for me, from my particular perspective, is different is that idea of non-human agency. And it is the idea that for them trying to describe it, it's that I have this deep connection and I'm receiving information from the environment in a very psychic, embodied way. And again, this is just with the adults. And that's how I know how to do it. So it's kind of a rejection of, in some ways, a rejection of formal schooling and formal education in conservation, and more of, I'm a human being on the planet, I can do conservation and I don't actually need to have a degree. I don't need to have an outward authority from the DNR. In fact, I might go against rules in the areas that I'm in to do conservation, to plant different trees that need some help, or to extract things that I want to plant in other areas. So in some ways, it's just like DIY. So I think that kind of personal empowerment and feeling, and also that feeling of being a Native person. So there's some things I didn't talk about in terms of, one day Kriya Miller asked the kids, do you feel like you're native to this place? What would it mean for you to be native to this place? So a lot of it too is trying to figure out what Indigenous people have done and doing caretaking without any sort of authority in that way. Did that answer your question?
Definitely.
Okay, great. Okay, so one more question if anybody has one. Sure.
I don't know if my question falls in overall your presentation or not, but I was just a little bit curious that what happens with kids or elder after their training, they do replicate whatever they have learned after the school, after the training,
Yeah.
in any way, or if you can talk something about it.
I can talk a little bit about that for sure, because again, a lot of what I do was to randomize my observations so that I could see what the kids were doing. It's just that the focus that I had didn't necessarily lend itself to exactly everything that the kids were doing. Parents would report what their kids were doing. So for instance, in the interviews, like, hey, is there anything that's changed as a result of your kids going? Like, yeah, they go outside, they just sit out there in the snow and they look at stuff and they'll tell me they're doing a sit spot. What in the world? They're so, like, why are they going out there in the cold? That's crazy. One of my favorite moments was talking to a parent. I'm sorry I'm blanking on her name, but I was walking with Matt Miller into the food co-op and she was walking out and she had her daughter Penny there. And the parent was saying, oh my gosh, I really love nature. I love Human Nature School. You guys are so great. You've changed our lives. You're so wonderful. But you know what? Every single time we hear an effing bird, we have to go find out what it is and it drives me crazy. So there are definitely, these are anecdotal instances where kids are taking what they're doing and they're taking it home. And also, they're given things called take-home challenges. So they're, go find 5 feathers in your backyard. Tell me what are 3 migrating birds that are coming through that you're seeing in the sky, and come report on us next time that you come back. So they're given homework in a way. John Young also talks about the fact a lot that one of the issues with this pedagogy is that if the parents aren't involved, what are the kids going to do? They're coming there once or twice a week. And it has to be, it's more effective whenever parents are involved. And so that's why there are so many different kinds of programs, fundraisers, and meetings for parents to come and see what's going on and to be very encouraged to, for instance, come to apprenticeship programs and stuff like that. But in terms of like imitating animals, I know when I was a kid, I imitated every cartoon character there was. So I'm not saying this is like strict evidence, but like seeing them run around like, I'm a chipmunk, I'm a gray fox, are you a red fox? No, and so I remember one time there was this kid who, right after what you saw in from the video data of bird language, all the kids have a free play time, and all the kids from this one instructor group, Lena, who was a wonderful instructor, all pretended like they were birds. And they ganged up on one bird that they thought was the prey species, and they were eating him. And his older brother of this prey species was pretending to fly around like this, and he goes, I'm a turkey vulture! I feast on the deceased! And he yelled it over and over and over again. It was awesome. So it's not that, these kids are definitely picking things up and taking it home. It's that, like, taking it home wasn't something I necessarily had as much access to as just being there in the program. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Cool, I think that's all we had time for. So thank you guys so much for coming. It was such a joy to